So this is part 2 in a series of videos where I am explaining how I took this 8-inch sculpture here and enlarged it to this sculpture that's about 5 feet tall. At the end of the last video we got to the point where we got this thing in one big piece of blue EPS foam. In this video I am going to talk about how I sculpted the face and sculpted the horns here. So this really is a tutorial on using this material called Magic Sculpt. Magic Sculpt is a 2-part epoxy resin. You mix it in equal parts, part A and part B, and it turns into this clay-like substance, and you have a short window of time to sculpt with it before it completely hardens. But when it does harden, it is this super durable material. It is basically like plumber's epoxy, but it is made specifically for artists by a company called Douglas & Sturgis in Richmond, California. I use this stuff all the time in my studio. It's one of my favorite products to sculpt with, and mainly because of its durability. These little tentacles here are made out of Magic Sculpt. There's no way I could do these in any kind of polymer clay and not have them break at some point. So you can get a lot of fine detail and make stuff that you don't have to worry about breaking during the shipping process. You can buy this stuff in quart kits or gallon kits. A gallon kit is about $100. So that's 2 gallons of material because you have a gallon of part A and a gallon of part B. So you measure out 2 equal-sized balls and start mixing. When I'm working on large-scale pieces, I set up this little kind of assembly line where I lay out a whole bunch of pre-shaped balls. This way I could just keep everything moving fast. As the clay starts to harden, it gets a little bit harder to work with. So if I could keep everything moving while the clay is soft, everything is just a lot easier. I do this mixing thing where I squish the clay in between the bottom of my hands, so I'm really using my wrists more than my fingers. Mixing these 2 balls here took me about 5 minutes. This is the perfect amount to mix for my process. I can keep mixing these small batches and adding it on top of the previous batch, methodically building up the piece while the entire time keeping the consistency and hardness of the clay somewhat the same, which makes it easier to sculpt as a uniform piece. The little holes with the screws here are just to help anchor the Magic Sculpt to the foam. Probably not really necessary, but just a little cheap insurance. So I start by pulling pieces off the mixed ball and flattening them into little snake shapes and just laying them across the surface. I try to spread it all in one direction, keeping it about 1/4 inch thick. I'm really trying to work fast at this point. After about 15 minutes, you could start to feel it starting to harden. You have about an hour to work with it before it gets to the point where it's just too hard. It's definitely easiest to work with in that first 30-minute window. After I get the first layer on, I will dip my gloves in water and give it kind of a wet rub down. It's almost like working with a water clay when you add water to it, so it's a great way to really smooth it out and move the stuff around. This water thing is something that I'll keep doing pretty much till the very end. I'll also come in with some wooden tools to push it around a little bit and cut in a clean edge, and do a little bit of sculpting, adding some pieces here and there. When I first started working with this clay, I was not that into it. It took me a long time to get used to working with something that's set up so fast. But now it's something that I can't imagine not having in my studio. I mean, besides sculpting, I use it for repairs, for structural stuff. Really, because of its durability, it's just an invaluable product. So here what I'm doing is I've wet a terry cloth towel and I'm pressing it into the Magic Sculpt. This will create a texture on the surface that will kind of look like fur. I'm going to be felting the body of this piece, so I feel like a little bit of texture on the face will complement the fuzziness of the felt. So here I'm cleaning up the edges with a little wooden paddle, then I'm putting a little water on it to smooth it out a bit, and then I'm pressing in some texture with the cloth. The cool thing about this cloth texture thing is that there's so many different types of cloth you can press in. I've used leather, burlap, a fabric that has like a cross stitch on it, and it creates a lot of nice effects with dry brushing. The details on the face I'll make with an assortment of wooden tools. I'll carve in the detail, pat it with the cloth, carve in some more detail, pat it again, and keep doing it until I get something that I like. At the end I'll spend a nice amount of time with the towel just really patting it over the surface, trying to get a nice even texture. For the horns it's basically the same thing. The shape is a little bit more complex, so I have to be a little bit more methodical. I'm basically starting at the bottom and spreading it thin and really just spiraling up the arm until I get to the fingertips. The only thing that's different here is I want this finish to be a lot smoother. I'm not going to be pressing the towel into the horns. I will have a little bit of texture because I'm going to do a rough sanding with it. So I do this raking thing to try to smooth out the surface. This is just a plastic serrated knife, and I'll rake it over the surface in all different directions. This is a great technique for evening out all the little bumps and valleys on the surface. Then I'll smooth all that texture out with a little bit of water and just keep working my way up. The tricky part is not letting one section get too hard before you attach another section. Usually that seam between two sections is the most problematic. But if you work fast enough and can keep the Magic Sculpt relatively soft, you can kind of sculpt it all together as one uniform piece. You don't have to finish everything all at once. The great thing about Magic Sculpt is you could let it set up, come back the next day, and sculpt more on top of it. It has no problem sticking to the hard stuff, and it's just as strong. I just prefer working this way because I feel like the end result just looks better. I feel like I get cleaner lines and there's just a lot less inconsistencies and a lot less sanding in the end. So this is what it looks like the next morning. It's definitely hard. There's a hard shell around this. It's probably about 1/8 of an inch thick. So really thin, but it's a strong material. There's still a lot of the texture in there that you can see from the knife, but all that will be sanded out, so I'm not really worried about that. So the next step is to sand it and smooth it out a bit. It does have a lot of little kind of bumpy areas, but the sandpaper will take all of that out. I'm using an orbital sander here, first with a 60 grit and then I go down to an 80 grit. There's a lot of spots that have to be hand sanded because the electric sander just can't get to them. When I'm hand sanding, I like to take one of the round orbital pads and cut it in half. This little half circle gives me a nice straight edge and a nice round edge that really let me get into all the little edges and corners. So here's what it looks like after the sanding. I went over this with a 60 grit and then an 80 grit. So there's still a little bit of texture left from the sandpaper, but I'm going to be dry brushing on top of this. So a little bit of texture is nice. So in the next video I'm going to go over how I painted the face and the horns. It's a lot of dry brushing with pinks and whites and golds for the face, and then some washes for the horns with a silver gouache dry brushed on top. You can see the texture here from the sandpaper, and you can see the texture here from the terry cloth. So I will be showing all of that, so stay tuned.
Don't panic, don't jump, don't stop the just rap. Don't panic, don't jump, don't stop the just rap. Don't panic, don't jump, don't